Welcome everybody to our STS synthetic workshop hosted by PCS. For those who don't know me, I'm Harry Nitos and I'm the head of synthetic outreach. I've been involved in securitization since 2000, first in research, then in structuring, and after that as an investor, and now since the beginning of this year I'm working at PCS. Today, we're going to have two excellent speakers, Ian Bell, who's been involved in securitization since 1988, and first as a lawyer at partner Clifford Chance, then as a general counsel and head of structured finance at S&P, and finally as CEO of PCS, and Dr. Martina Spaeth, who started securitization in 1997, first at UBS, then at Fitch. Then she moved on to HVB UniCredit, where she was responsible for dealing with synthetic transactions, which was at the time one of the largest synthetic issuers. From there, she moved to FMS, and then she moved to PCS. Just to give you some kind of notes, there's going to be a Q&A session. For where you can ask questions. The questions are private. I'll have to read those questions out, so you can keep your anonymity. We will try to cover as much ground as we can, but given the short amount of time that we have, I'm offering and I'm encouraging everyone for any questions that we might have not answered, or any questions that might arise through this workshop. Please do reach out to us, and we will organize for each one of you a session where we can go for any particular questions that you might have. And without further ado, I would like to introduce Ian, and you can start the session. Ian? Hello, Ian.
Harry, if you could confirm that you can hear me, that would be nice.
I can hear you.
Excellent. And we should have the camera now, but I'm not seeing it. So not that seeing me is a good thing. There.
Okay, but I think we can now start.
Okay, so even though you probably can't see me, and as I said, that's probably a good thing. We will start this presentation. The presentation is going to be in two parts. First of all, a general overview of synthetics, what they are, how they work, why they were created. And then a second part after the coffee break, where we will be looking at the STS synthetics regime, which is the new regime that came into place in April of this year. As you'll see from the agenda, if you're looking at the agenda, there's also PCS who we are. We're not going to go through the slides, but as you will be able to have the slides, you will be able to actually figure out who we are if you haven't worked it out yet. Okay. Oh, excellent. It looks like you can now see me. So first of all, we've called this a public service announcement. In terms of the nomenclature, we're going to be talking here about synthetic securitizations, but you may have heard the on-balance sheet securitization. This is the expression that is used in the STS regulation amendment, which we'll discuss in the second part. And therefore, you need to remember, or you need to know, that these terms are effectively interchangeable. I can tell you that the idea of using the words on balance sheet securitization, I think, emanated from the European Commission, because it was felt that synthetic securitization just sort of didn't sound like something you would want to share with your family. and therefore they decided on a less, what they thought was politically less sensitive term, on-balance sheet securitization. But what you need to know is that even though we will talk about synthetic securitization, if you hear the expression on-balance sheet securitization, it is exactly the same thing. Okay, so true sale versus synthetic. That in the world of securitization, you have these two groups: true sale versus synthetic. What is the difference? Well, first of all securitizations are basically limited recourse asset-based finance. And when we talk about assets, they're usually financial assets, pretty much always financial assets, where the investors take the risks of the assets. What does that mean? That means fundamentally this is not secured lending. If you have secured lending, you have an entity that is obligated to pay, and it's provided some security so that if it fails to pay, then you can look to the security to get your money back. In securitization, the entity doesn't promise to pay you anything at all. You, as an investor, are reliant 100% on those assets and only those assets. There is no recourse to the entity called the originator in securitization. There is no recourse to the entity who's provided you these assets if it all goes terribly wrong. So that's the heart of securitization, if you want. How do you achieve a structure where the investors take the risk of the assets? Well, in true sale securitization, and the clue is in the name, you sell the assets, usually to a special purpose vehicle, pretty much invariably actually to a special purpose vehicle. And that sale has to be by what is known in the trade as a true sale, so that basically those assets are ring-fenced from anything that can go wrong to the originator. If you're not doing a true sale securitization, then you'll be doing another kind of securitization, which is the one we are talking about today, which is a synthetic securitization. And going back in the mist of time, a synthetic securitization was a securitization where there was no sale of the assets to a special purpose vehicle, but where the structure tried to replicate the structure of a true sale securitization. Back in the day, synthetic securitization was dreamt up by people who tried to provide securitization benefits and risk rewards in situations where you couldn't sell the asset. Maybe there was a prohibition in the assets itself against the sale, which meant you couldn't sell the asset. And remember, when we talk about assets here, we are talking about financial assets, loans, mortgages, car loans, etc., corporate loans. Maybe there was a prohibition against the sale in the asset itself. Maybe in your country, a sale attracted an enormous amount of tax. Or in some cases, for example, when you had SMEs or corporates, a sale, in order to be effective in your jurisdiction, required you to notify the borrower. Notify the borrower that you had sold his assets, and a lot of banks said, I don't want to go and see my prime customers and tell them, by the way, I just flogged your asset because I'm not really that interested in it. I flogged your loan. So in all those various circumstances, people said, we'd like to do securitization, but we can't do a true sale. Is there a way in which we could actually create the equivalent of securitization without a sale? And that's where the word synthetic came up. It's a form of securitization. So, sorry, but somebody says we cannot hear any sound. So if you don't hear anything, that's a bit of a problem. Sorry, just a little bit disturbed there by this person. Yeah, okay. I'm going to assume that the other 138 people who are on the call do listen to me. Can you hear me? Because there's no true sale, of course, the asset remains on the balance sheet of the originator, and that's hence why on-balance sheet securitization seemed like an equivalent term to synthetic, and maybe less provocative to people who don't understand securitization. So as I said, back in the day, synthetic securitization was a way to achieve a securitization without a true sale, and therefore the two categories have the same parent. They come from the same place. However, over the years, like many families, the siblings sort of drifted apart. They drifted apart in the sense that the investors became very different. The motivations for doing a synthetic securitization became very different from a true sale. And we're going to go through that in the next few slides. And so those two types of securitization basically became quite distinct in the market. It wasn't the same market with just two technologies. It was two very distinct markets. However, they remain securitization. And they remain securitizations because that's what the law says. In Europe, and it's different in the United States, but in Europe, a securitization is a financial device where the investors take the risk of the securitized assets, and that was my first point, and which also has credit tranching. And that's the second necessary part of a transaction for it to be a securitization as a matter of law in Europe. That is, that you have to have credit tranching, you have to have different groups of investors who take different seniority positions vis-a-vis the asset. So there has to be a group that takes the losses first, and then a group that takes the losses second. And tranching can be, 2 tranches, or it can be 1,000 tranches. I've never seen a 1,000 tranche deal, but I have seen a 32 tranche deal in the United States. It went very badly, but that's life. But you can have more than 2 tranches. But what is clear is you can't have 1 tranche. If you only have one type of investor, one seniority, then it is not securitization, even if you basically are relying only on the assets to get paid back. So, as I said, these two groups moved apart to different market segments, different rationales. We're going to talk about that, but they both remain securitizations, and that's important because that means that when rules and regulations were passed about securitization, whether in the context of Basel or in the context of the general securitization regulation that was passed in 2017 and came into force in 2019, synthetic securitizations were covered by those because they were securitizations. So, this is a slide that I think is very important for those of you who haven't worked in synthetic securitizations for many years. When you first come across synthetic securitization, true probably of all securitization, but particularly of synthetic securitizations, it's an ocean of acronyms. CLO, CDO, CLN, excess spread. There's an ocean of various technical jargon terms. And it's very difficult when you speak to somebody who's been steeped into securitization for a large part of their professional life to actually make sense of what the hell they're saying. Partially it's because securitization is fairly complex, partially I think is because it probably causes your brain some damage over time if you spend too much time in securitization, although I'm maybe just talking to myself here. But it is very complicated as first. And therefore it's important to go back to basics. It's actually important to understand at a very basic level what it is we are talking about, and so that you can then build up an image of what's going on in synthetic securitization from a fundamental, simple understanding. And the simple understanding I would propose, although I know that the lawyers in the audience, probably their heart rate is going a little bit up now and they're a little bit uncomfortable. Synthetic securitization is basically insurance. Now, I said heart rates of the lawyers in the audience are going up. Why is that? Because, of course, if synthetic securitization truly was insurance in the legal sense of the term, they would have to go to jail. Because doing insurance business, a real insurance business, without an insurance license, without being in a regulated insurance company, is a criminal offense. So, to be clear, this is a theoretical slide. This is a conceptual slide. This is my attempt to explain securitization, synthetic securitization, to people who have never come across the concept, or who have come across the concept and are confused about how it really works. So just to be clear, synthetic securitization is not legally an insurance product. But if you want to try to understand how it works, it's insurance. Basically, I'm a bank, I could be a corporate, but usually it's a bank. I'm a bank, I've lent money to somebody. I'm possibly concerned that this person will not pay me back. So I get credit insurance in the form of a synthetic. What does that mean? Is I find someone who in the context of a synthetic is called either a protection provider or an investor. I find somebody to say to me, okay, if you lose money on this loan, I'll compensate you. Despite all the forms, whether this is a CDS or whether it is a CLN or whether it's a CDO, basically that's the fundamental essence, if you want, of a synthetic. It's a form of credit insurance, right? Even if, again, to my lawyer friends, I was a lawyer once, I understand their pain, even if it's not an insurance product from the point of view of the law, in terms of common sense, normal understanding, it is an insurance product. And if you understand it as basically a credit insurance product, it makes a lot of things much simpler. So I said that true sale and synthetics sort of drifted apart as siblings often do. And here I'm going to try to kind of sort of capture the differences. So first of all, true sale, because you've got a sale, you have a sale price, which means that the investors part with money for the sale, and that money is taken by the originator as the proceeds of sale. So what that means is that when you have a true sale, you always have cash. And the investor, or the originator, always ends up with cash. So a true sale is always funding, always provides funding for the originator. Originally, back in the late 80s in Europe, in the late 80s in Europe, early 90s, securitizations were also a way of managing your capital. You got rid of the assets on the balance sheet and you therefore were able to have less capital requirements against those assets because the risk had been removed. There were then in the 90s some changes to accountancy rules, there were some changes to prudential rules, there were, and the Basel requirements came in, and therefore true sale securitization really ceased to be a capital management tool and really became a funding tool. Recently, with Basel III on the horizon, what we're seeing is that the use of true sale securitization as a capital management tool is starting to come back, right? But for a very long time, it was just a funding tool. In synthetics, as you'll see when my colleague Martina talks about this, in synthetics, sometimes you don't even have any cash at all. You don't need cash. I mean, if I go and insure my house, I don't expect the insurer to give me cash. Sometimes you do have cash, and we'll go through the reasons why you may choose to have cash. But often quite often you don't have cash, and therefore often there's no funding at all. On the other hand, you're doing the synthetic for some reason. If you're not doing it for cash, there must be some reason, and that reason is almost invariably, and I should actually say invariably, it's capital management. Maybe economic capital management. You may not be looking for any Basel benefit, but it is basically removing risk from your balance sheet so that you do not have to allocate, either in your economic models or in your regulatory models, capital against that risk. So true sale, primarily funding, starting to become capital again. Synthetics, always capital. Economic or regulatory, pretty much more regulatory these days than economic, but that also reflects Basel's approach. True sale securitization, you've got notes, pretty much invariably. You've got highly rated senior notes, some mezzanines, usually no first loss. Again, it may not always be the case, and there's my little comment there, warning for every rule, somebody will tell you about an exception. So all of these things are generalizations. I'm sure that somebody will put their hand up and say, oh, but I did a deal like 3 years ago and it didn't do the way it works, the way you said. But basically, you've got senior notes going out, you've got some mezzanine notes. Very rarely have you got any first loss, pretty much never. In synthetics, you're trying to get rid of the capital. So the capital, and we're going to go through that in the slides that follow, the capital really lives at the first loss in the mezz place, right? I mean, it's to cover losses, and therefore expected losses, unexpected losses at the bottom of the capital structure, that you have a synthetic. And therefore, you always have either a first loss or a mezz, sometimes a first loss and a mezz piece, but you don't really need to synthetically get rid of the senior tranche, and we're going to go through that, because that's not the purpose. You can, but it's very rare. So, highly rated senior notes, some mezz in true sale, mezz, first loss, in synthetic, very rarely any senior positions. True sale is a classic capital markets instrument. It's a bond, pretty much always. So it is, distributed like a bond. You have a prospectus, you have syndication, you have initial price talk, you have roadshows, etc. And you distribute it to as many people, and they have allocations. And you may have 10 investors, you may have 30 investors, you may have 100 investors. Although that's pretty rare in European securitization these days. Synthetics, because you're looking primarily at mezz investors or junior investors, so you have less volume, but also they are taking quite a lot of risk. I mean, they're taking sophisticated risk. And so you have usually a very much smaller number of investors, often just one, maybe 2, 3. There's no distribution. It's sort of more like a private, well, it is a private deal. Very rarely you wouldn't have a prospectus, very rare to have a prospectus. So not a bond distribution, much more of a private market with very few players in any given transaction. And final point is just that. At the end of this true sale securitization, you have bonds, they trade in the secondary market, you get BWICs, you get secondary market pricing. Whereas in the synthetics, because you have a very small number of investors who've done an awful lot of work, usually they spend quite a lot of months negotiating with the originator, there's really no secondary market. This is a buy and hold market. Now, to be fair, true sale securitization tends to be a buy and hold market in that it's relatively rare to trade in the secondary market, but it does happen, and it's certainly possible, whereas it pretty much never happens in synthetics. So if you are brave enough to dive into the world of synthetics, there are certain names or certain words I would have said that you need to understand. You will hear them a lot, like all jargon. It's partially there to make things easy for people who know the subject to speak. It's also there to keep outsiders out because they have no idea what the hell you're talking about. And in some cases, it also makes you look smarter than you probably are. So here are some jargon words that you will need to get to know. Protection buyer. So in a true sale securitization, the bank, usually a bank, could be a fintech, could be a corporation, could be a captive finance company, but the entity that sells the assets and raises the money in the securitization is known as the originator. And that expression is also used in synthetics. But because I was saying synthetics are really a form of insurance, the originator is also buying protection. So he or she, or it, will be called the protection buyer. So if you hear the word protection buyer, if you're more familiar with true sale securitization, think originator. And equally, as a mirror image, the investor is the protection seller and the protection provider. So again, if you're more familiar with the world of true sale, protection seller, protection provider is the investor. Reference pool is the pool of assets which are being securitized. Reference pools, obviously in a true sale, you have a sale, so the pool is the pool, the asset pool. Reference pools, because they exist on paper rather than an actual sale, can be defined in lots of different ways. So you can name just names, i.e. these are borrowers against which I'm buying protection. You can describe individual loans, you can describe types of loans. You've got a lot more flexibility. But what is insured, what is the assets of the securitization, will be called in synthetic the reference pool. And then you have attachment points and detachment points. Again, this is where thinking of this as an insurance it makes life a lot simpler. The attachment point is the point of losses where the investors, the protection sellers, now have to pay money. So below the attachment point, they don't have to pay money. Think of it as a deductible. So I have a billion euro pool of assets, which I am synthetically securitizing. The first loss will be, let us say, I'm making these numbers up, but we'll say be 100 million. And I will securitize, I will have an investor for the mezzanine piece, which goes from 100 million to 300 million. And then there's the senior piece from 300 million to a billion. What does that mean? That means that if I suffer 10 million, 20 million, 30, 40, 95, 99 million of losses on that billion pool, that's my problem as the bank. That has not been securitized. It hasn't been, no protection has been purchased for that first loss. When I get to 100 million, 100 million and 1 euro, that euro has to be paid for by the investor. And that borderline between 99.9 and 101 is the attachment point. And so you can think of it in insurance as a deductible. You insure your car for 10,000 euros. I don't know, that's maybe a lot for a car. I don't have a car. But there's a deductible. So the first 500 euros of loss, just you get to pay for that, the insurance doesn't pay. 501, the insurance has to pay, up to 10,000. If your car's worth 20,000, everything above 10,000 you don't get, right? So you'll get, 9,500. Going back to my billion pool, the investors will have to pay, I said the mezzanine between 100 and 300 million. So the next 200 million of losses on that pool, they will have to pay for one way or another. Let's say you're really not very good at your business of lending money, and you start suffering losses at 301, 302, 302, all the way up to a billion. They're not covering that. Their risk as an investor, as a protection seller, is only 200 million. So the point at which they no longer have to pay you is the detachment point. Right? So you've got an attachment point, which is 0 to the first loss deductible, and then you get payment from your investor, protection seller, all the way to your detachment point, and after that, it doesn't go. And we have these here. We'll go through that later. So basically, the other two concepts you're going to hear about are funded and unfunded. In the world of insurance, if you insure your car, for say 10,000 euros, you don't ask the insurer to give you 10,000 euros just in case you crash your car and the insurer is not willing to pay you. You basically, as somebody who insures a car, take the credit risk of the insurance company. Now, that's fine, and plus you don't much have a choice. There are no insurance companies that are going to collateralize insurance obligations out there when you get car insurance. But in the world of finance, that doesn't work that way. If you do a synthetic remove risk on an unfunded basis, which means that no money is paid by the protection seller, you're going to take the protection seller's credit risk. If you start suffering losses, you turn to your credit seller, to your protection seller, and that protection seller is bust when you turn to him, that's just tough. You're not going to get your money. And so another way of structuring synthetic securitizations is on a funded basis, where the protection seller has to part with an amount of cash equivalent to the protection that it is selling you, and that is parked. And if losses over that 100 million, to take the same example of a billion pool with a detachment point of 100 to 300, if you start taking losses as the protection buyer, you're just going to help yourself to that pool of cash. And that means that if the protection seller goes bankrupt during the life of your deal, you don't have to worry about it because you've got that cash. Right? So unfunded versus funded, those are key notions. So I said it's all about capital. It's primarily about regulatory capital. I'm not going to belabor this slide, but basically this explains to you why STS synthetic regulations is coming into place now, because from 1999, where we had Basel I that failed, we had Basel II that failed, now we have Basel III. Basel III is coming in 2023, despite a lot of banks begging the European Commission and the European Parliament to push back that deadline, that they don't seem to be moving on this. And that's going to raise enormously the capital requirements for European banks, and therefore getting a way to manage your capital by reducing your asset risk, and therefore not being hit quite so badly by the rise in capital requirements is going to come in line with Basel III in 2023, has become very important. And so that's why we're looking at this. And so this is basically a kind of sort of conceptual approach to capital to understand why synthetic securitization, why purchases of credit protection are important. Structurally, if you think of how a bank works, if you've got assets, they are stacked like this. At the bottom, you will have expected losses. Those can be very, very small. Mortgages, expected losses can be as low as 1 basis point, half basis point, 5 basis points, something like that. In credit cards, it can be a lot more. Expected losses have to be paid for from the business. If the losses you expect to make on a pool are not paid for by the business, then you're going to lose money by definition. Capital is required by regulators and shareholders to cover the unexpected loss. You don't want to be in a situation where the first dollar of unexpected loss means that you're technically insolvent. And so you need to have capital for that. And then above that, there's apocalyptic loss. You don't have capital for that. If you start suffering those kind of losses, you will go insolvent, but they're supposed to be losses that are not really conceivable in anything other than a total meltdown, right? And so that's overlaying on this. You have therefore this idea of attachment point and detachment point. If you cover the attachment point and the detachment point, for example, you don't have to, but for example, to cover the whole unexpected loss, economic theory, financial theory tells you that you have now removed all need for capital. Now, in reality and in regulation, it doesn't work that way. This is very much a financial theory slide that shows you conceptually why or how buying protection will limit your capital requirements, right? And that's why here, this slide is simply to tell you, don't get confused. Apocalyptic loss, unexpected loss, expected loss is a financial theory model of how banks work in theory. The way the regulation works and the way CRR defines senior, mezzanine, and first loss doesn't match the financial theory. It's based on that financial theory, but it doesn't match it. So this slide is just there to say to you guys, don't get confused between what happens in real regulation and what happens in financial theory. Financial theory explains how synthetics help and work and in theoretical basis, conceptual basis. When you get to regulation, it gets a lot more complicated, a lot more technical, and so don't confuse the two. So I know I'm running a little bit late here, and my Lord Master is telling me to accelerate. So if you go back here to that slide, the idea is that capital is required for unexpected losses, and when you go to this slide on CRR, that is what you would call potentially the mezzanine and the first loss. You want to get a synthetic that allows you to go to your regulator and say, I don't need capital anymore because the rules require me to have capital against first loss and unexpected loss, mezzanine, first loss, and I've removed that risk. I've got somebody else to pay for it, and therefore, please, can I not have capital requirements against this? That's the basic theory. The practice runs through a series of regulation on what is known as significant risk transfer, SRT for short. So here, SRT as a piece of jargon, it is significant risk transfer. And these are the very, very complicated rules by which your prudential regulator as a bank is willing to accept that you have genuinely removed the risk. You can't simply say, I've got a synthetic, I'm done. No, it has to meet a whole series of very complicated, very quantitative and qualitative measures. And that's why there is a bullet point here which says, in practice, operating the combination of CRT and the SRT rules, and the SRT rules is close to performing delicate brain surgery in the dark, just with more maths. The rules in Europe that explain how much capital you need to have are the capital requirements regulations, the CRR regulations, and the rules that tell you when an asset is no longer an asset for the purposes of CRR or the SRT rules. Both CRR and SRT are exceedingly complex, subject to hundreds of pages of legislation and thousands of pages of prudential interpretation. And you need to meet those in order to get basically your capital relief by convincing your prudential regulator that you have removed the risk. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through this slide particularly, but what you need to know very briefly is that the SRT rules, I said there's a lot of maths and there's a lot of qualitative. You need to meet two sets of tests, the qualitative test and the quantitative test. And without going through the two quantitative tests, which is the mezzanine test and the first loss test, they're on the slide. The basic idea is whatever device your synthetic securitization is, you have to show two things. Let's start with the quantitative test first. You have to show that you have removed enough risk, that the amount of risk you claim to have removed is sufficient and of the right kind of risk to explain that you need no longer have the full capital requirements against that risk. So you basically have to remove enough of the right kind of risk, and that's going to be measured by the quantitative test. The second thing you need to show is that that risk that you say by the quantitative test you've removed, you have to really show that you have removed it. That you haven't had a clever device where you're really keeping the risk, although you're pretending to remove it. And that's the qualitative test. Your prudential regulator has lots of rules about when can that risk be deemed to genuinely have been removed. And that's the qualitative test. And you need to meet the qualitative test and the quantitative test. I have really removed the right amount of risk before the regulator says, fine, your capital requirements, your prudentially required capital requirements can now drop. And with this, I will turn you over to my colleague Martina Spaeth, who will take you through the structures of synthetic securitizations.
Hello, everyone. I will just continue, since you've heard a lot about the key terms of synthetic securitization already, with the actually three main legal devices that you can use to transfer the risk of a tranche, as we've learned. It can be a mezzanine tranche, it can be a junior tranche, it can also be a senior tranche, to the investor being the protection seller and the originator being the protection buyer. So one of the devices is the guarantee, which is guarantee is what it feels like anyway, the whole the synthetic securitization. And the other two devices are actually credit derivatives. Credit derivatives on an unfunded or a funded basis, or unfunded credit derivatives that you attach funding to. So credit derivative is credit derivative, and there are slightly different rules for the credit events that you're allowed to have under guarantee structures and credit derivative structures. We'll talk about that a little bit later. what you do when you have a credit default swap is that you have a credit risk, a tranched credit risk of your portfolio, which you agree to swap against protection payment. So if you have a default, as Ian explained, that reaches into that tranche, then the investor reimburses you for this loss on this particular tranche. So the notional of such a credit derivative is always exactly the size of that tranche, and there's a premium that the originator pays to the investor for getting reimbursed for losses. The credit-linked notes are another tool, and they actually feel like a normal bond, because what you do is you issue a bond, a funded instrument, which can be either issued directly or by the issuer, by the originator, or through an SPV. I'll show you the different structures in a moment. And this credit-linked note, this bond, attaches itself to the risk that you are selling. So depending on where in the capital structure the credit-linked note lies, this is exactly the risk that you attach to this funded instrument. So on the one hand, you've got the funding like a normal bond. On the other hand, which you see through the coupon, you have attached the risk, which you have a premium that you pay for that risk that you are selling. So going on to the next slide. There we are. So funded or unfunded, that is both possible, and it depends, and we will have a lot more about that later on in our second session as well, which is sort of the decision tree at the end that you go through as an originator. What am I going to do? Am I going to do a funded transaction? Am I going to do an unfunded transaction? Everything is possible, and as Ian said, it is complicated, because at the end of the day, you need to decide what is the price I'm paying for the different instruments, and what is the capital relief that I can achieve. So it's actually most easiest to just look at the different structures that there are. The first one is the unfunded structure, where you actually, on the face of it, don't do much at all. You've got your reference pool, you have tranched it, and you have decided where you have your attachment and detachment points of the first loss, mezzanine, tranche, and senior. And then what you do is that you have a financial guarantee or credit derivative, being normally a credit default swap, on either the mezzanine or the first loss, or even the senior tranche. Very often it is done on the mezzanine, and then you have a credit protection provider. Now, what you do when you have a credit default swap is that you actually, on this tranche, say it's the mezzanine tranche, you reduce your credit risk of this tranche to no more credit risk, to nothing, to zero. But of course, being unfunded, you take on the credit risk of the credit protection provider, the counterparty risk. So if the credit protection provider is not, depending on their rating, is not sort of so good, not as good as the pool, then this instrument would make no sense. So you need a credit protection provider which is of a good credit quality. The best possible credit quality would of course be a public or supranational institution, as you see very often in these synthetic transactions, because they have a 0% counterparty risk. So in that case, if you do an unfunded transaction, this is a very efficient way of doing it, because the credit protection provider provides you with a 0% risk for this certain tranche that you have sold the risk on. Now, if you can't find a credit protection provider of such outstanding quality from a regulatory counterparty risk perspective, then you would possibly decide to go for some kind of funding, because if you deposit cash against this counterparty risk, which you have got into by doing by getting this financial guarantee, then you can once again reduce your credit risk to zero because you've got the cash against it. So what the credit protection provider does is that he buys the risk, but he also deposits cash so that you have security against his counterparty risk. And there are rules that come with all that. So you can, for example, deposit the cash at the originator himself. If the rating is on a single A level. It can also be on a triple B level, but you would need to get permission from the authorities. And otherwise, you can also, of course, deposit the cash in a different bank, which has the sufficient rating, and then you actually have this counterparty risk of that bank again. So it can actually be a little bit tricky, but of course the easiest way of doing it is if it is possible to deposit it actually with yourselves as an originator. What is also often the case is that you have partial funding. So you don't go for funded or unfunded over the whole, say, 1 billion of pool, but you decide to fund the mezzanine tranche of which you're setting the risk, or the junior tranche, because that is the better structure, because you can get down to 0% counterparty risk, even if the credit protection provider is not a 0% counterparty. And the senior part, which is from a size perspective normally the biggest, could be 80%, is very often retained by the originator. Because if you have structured it and put the risk into the first loss and the mezzanine loss, then you end up with a senior which has a very good rating or internal rating using the calculations, and you can end up with a 10% risk weight on the senior bit, and so that is actually not harmful to keep. So that is often done, and I'll show you the last structure, which is the most fancy structure and the most complicated structure, and the one that actually reminds you most of a traditional securitization, because you have an SPV involved, and this SPV issues tranches. All of these tranches are credit-linked notes, so they each tranche bears part of the risk. In our example here, we have sold the mezzanine risk, but we have tranched that one up again. That's possible to do. And you have the super senior, which you can fund as well, or not fund, partial, as we've seen before. So this is a situation where you've got an SPV in the middle. The SPV can, once again, deposit the cash with the originator or elsewhere, subject to rating requirements and rating triggers. What is also possible, and it is not on one of our slides, but is you can do a direct issuance of credit-linked notes, which would be directly issued from the originator. Oh no, that's the next slide, sorry, I forgot. Yeah, so this is the direct issuance. So in this case, you're back to a simple structure like in the unfunded structure, but it is funded and the cash directly goes to the reference pool. There's no intermediate step of investing the cash somewhere. So this is also a very efficient structure. And this structure is, of course, a simplification of the real thing. There are a few more bells and whistles to that, and also what has to be remembered is that the retention rules, which you all know from the true sale securitization, also apply to synthetic transactions and can actually be done rather synthetically, because what you can do, as you can also do in true sale, is that you keep 5% of each of the loans, and because you're not selling the loans anyway, this can all be done on a sort of calculation basis. So you can only ever sell 95% of an exposure that you would have to an obligor. That's how you would actually do, or most typically see the retentions that is done. There's other retention forms, of course. Also, if you keep the first loss, you are retaining. So there's other ways of doing it, but to be borne in mind that the retention is also part of the synthetic rules. Now, the next slide goes into the real heart of the risk transfer. Is how do I convince the authorities to give me SRT? Well, one of the most important things is that I have a steady set of credit events that are real credit events and that cover the risk, and that mean that as an originator, I do not bear any of these risks myself. Well, I do up to a certain point, depending on the tranching, but when there is a problem with an asset in my pool, this problem needs to be the investor's problem, obviously. So the credit event definitions have the payment default of a reference obligation. Obviously, that is a problem. Insolvency, that is a problem. And the most tricky one of the credit events in its definition and living up to it is the restructuring of a reference obligation. Because the restructuring of a reference obligation can be, for all kinds of reasons, you can restructure a reference obligation, and it may not actually be a credit issue at the end of the day. So there is a concrete definition of how the restructuring, which type of restructuring needs to be part of the credit event definitions, and that is to be found in the CRR, Article 216, and you need to make sure that you keep to these rules in your definition of the restructuring event. So the restructuring, in a nutshell, that you are allowed to declare as a credit event has to always mean your obligor is in some kind of trouble, and you, as a bank, restructuring in a way of forgiving or deferring or some kind of action which leads to a loss on the side of the bank, which you then need to have transferred to your investor. So this is about the credit events. There are further credit events that can be added. The list is endless. You can add as many credit events as you like, but you need to, of course, keep the minimum of credit events that are necessary for SRT, and it's based on discussions with investors of how many credit events they would accept in addition to that. What is new in the way we now look at STS synthetic transactions is that as soon as a credit event happens, there needs to be a loss payment straight away meaning 180 days after the credit event, which feels like straight away because it does take a while until the bank actually, or the securitization, the transaction management becomes aware of the credit event, and this credit event is verified, and we'll go into that in a little bit more detail, and we actually have a credit event that is becomes known to the investor. And as soon as that credit event is there, the loss, the initial loss, which is in a sense the regulatory loss, it is just simply the regulatory PD in the bank's books times the LGD in the bank's books, which is the so-called interim loss in the regulation, or initial loss, which needs to be paid by the investor. So the investor needs to come up with this loss. And only after that first payment, after a long time, which can take years, the bank will work out this loss, this credit event, and there might be there might be a cure, there might be more losses, there might be a loss that is actually not as large as the initial loss, and then at the end of the day, after many years potentially, the investor will actually, and that's very important, a very important part of the SRT rules, the investor actually pays for the real loss, the realized loss. So this is sort of at the real heart of a synthetic transaction and the way the credit risk is actually transferred to the investor. Do we have more time, or do we?
We have more time.
We have more time? Okay. Good.
7 minutes.
Okay. A really important thing that I'll just mention it here because it is so important is that credit events happen in the bank somewhere. There's some person who looks after this loan, and there's a problem with the obligor, and it goes into the department that looks after recoveries and after dealing with restructurings, etc., and so on. But the transaction itself, the transaction management of this bank, will not have any direct contact to the servicing of the loan. And that is a really important thing. It needs to be covenanted, represented by the originator that there is absolutely no contact. And the information on, for example, this initial loss payment is just simply drawn out of the bank systems, PD times LGD. This is what the investor has to pay, and then later on, when there's the workout stand and the assets have been sold, etc., the real loss. All this always happens without the knowledge, without any contact to the bank itself, and the workout, the department that looks after any of these losses and problem loans. And another really important part, this is the third bullet here, the verification agent. The verification agent has to be independent of the originator. It's normally an accounting firm who checks when the credit event occurs, checks that this credit event has occurred based on the information given to the verification agent by the originator, and then later on, when the realized loss is being paid, when there's a compensation for the realized the losses and the initial losses being corrected, either the investor pays more or gets some money back. This whole calculation is checked by this independent verification agent based once again on the information the bank delivers to the investor, to the verification agent. What's the next one? Yeah. So I think I've already passed very much from the theory to practice. We do these synthetic transactions, so they're being done to reduce regulatory capital. The SRT is a precondition for the whole transaction working out. The credit events are mandatory. You can't say, "Oh, this credit event is not going to be part of the credit default swap." Every credit event needs to be paid for, and paid for straight away initially. Restructurings also, if you just forego principal, for example, this amount gets reimbursed for straight away by the investor. There are very, very limited termination rights. That's also part of this whole idea of not really being able to give the investors the opportunity to run away from a deteriorating pool. Once he's locked in for life, for the life of the transaction. And there's use of collateral. That means that there is rules around this cash. I was talking about the cash that can be deposited. if you have a credited note, it's direct cash that goes either to the STV or the originator, and this cash can be invested, but it's the rules are very strict around that. Then there's the types of counterparties. I was talking about a decision tree. When you decide to do a synthetic transaction as an originator, you need to take into account who's going to be my counterparty, and is the counterparty risk going to be worth doing an unfunded deal? Do I use funding, etc.? The use of excess spread, synthetic excess spread is a very, very special type of animal. It's in a way there is no excess spread because I'm not selling assets, so there is no cash that runs through the transaction. But synthetically, because everything is done on a synthetic basis, everything is calculated. You can also calculate an excess spread, and we're going to hear a bit more about that as well. And of course, there's the premium that you pay to the protection seller, being the counterparty, the investor, which can be very, very different depending on what you're selling. If you're selling a first loss tranche, then the premium can be really high, but that's nothing to be scared about, as we'll see later, because of course you're selling more risk. So that you have to get a good feeling for the right premium to be paid to the protection sellers. And then there is, of course, as always, rules around this. For example, the premium that are paid to protection sellers are not allowed to have a special structure like upfront or things like that. They need to be on a contingent basis, and they're paid as long as the protection is prevailing. Now, I think we have time for Q&A, and I will pass this on.
We're exactly on time.
Exactly on time. Perfect.
So Harry, I don't know if we have any questions.
We have so far 4 questions. I'm not sure whether you can see that on the question section. The first question was about the EBA paper on SRT and whether we have an opinion about it and where we can comment on that.
That's the one thing about webinar open to everybody is you don't know who's listening. Look, all I will say is that broadly, I mentioned that doing SRT is a bit like doing brain surgery in the dark, but with more maths. Broadly, and also bear in mind, SRT is not a core PCS scale. I mean, it's not what we do. But broadly, in listening to the market, we get the sense that the paper is fairly okay. I mean, that it does sort of meet, the broad requirements. Nobody that we know is setting their hair on fire because they will never be able to do a deal based on that paper. There are obviously many technical issues, many wrinkles that could be improved. But broadly, I think the feeling we get from speaking to market participants that it's not in a bad place.
Thank you for that. The second is regarding the amendments of STS regulations for STS synthetics. Can you click the
So we couldn't really hear that one.
In relation to STS and regarding synthetic transactions, basically this particular page, what are your views on those changes?
Well, actually, that's going to basically be the subject matter of the second part of the presentation. One thing I would say, since we have the time here, and it may save us some time, therefore, in the second part, is that the synthetic STS regime has had a strange birth. It it comes from the true sale STS regime, and most of the rules required for synthetic STS come from the true sale. But the true sale STS regime was structured very explicitly as an investor protection regulation. It was there to protect, looking back at the crisis of 2007 and the crisis of 2008, where people thought that investors bought bad securitizations. And so it was designed to make sure that we didn't have a repeat of that crisis with bad product being purchased by investors. So it's fundamentally an investor protection measure. When that investor protection structure of the true sale STS regime was brought into synthetics, there was a change in direction at the level of public authorities. And that change in direction can be seen, and we'll talk about it when we talk about the STS synthetics regime, by the fact that only originators holding senior tranches could benefit, that only SRT transactions could benefit. So the change in direction when the synthetic regime was being drafted involved really creating a regime that was looking after the originator and ensuring that SRT was achieved and strengthening SRT. And so in a way, it's a little bit like a Frankenstein creature. It's got the torso of an investor protection regime, which is taken from the true sale STS regime, and then it's got the limbs of a originator risk transfer SRT regime grafted onto it. So I think the regime works. I think we've been working on transactions. It's doable. It certainly doesn't put on any barriers which are insuperable to doing synthetic STS. But it is a little bit of a strange creature because, one way you determine whether an interpretation, let's say, of a piece of legislation is, what was the intention of the legislator? What were the legislators trying to achieve here? And that's made a little bit tricky when, as I said, as a Frankenstein creature, there seems to be two fairly different and not always entirely compatible intentions. So it is a little bit of a strange one, but it is workable.
We had a comment from one of the participants saying you obviously don't have to have an FTP bankruptcy restructuring credit event in a guarantee structure.
That's correct. Right? That's absolutely correct. I mean, I was talking about the different credit events, and the minimum two credit events are failure to pay and bankruptcy by the obligor for a guarantee. If you use a guarantee as a financial instrument, and if you use a credit default swap or credit linked note, then you need to add the restructuring. That's correct. I was talking about the different credit events, but she's right. That is the formal requirement. Those two are the only ones required. You can leave the restructuring out if you use as a financial instrument the guarantee.
There appears to be a number of discrete structure flavors, but the devil is in the details of the plain gray area. Will STS mean that these elements will become more standardized, in quotation limited, to aid tradability of instruments created by, let's say, for example, CLNs, and what the synthetic investor market is even seeking? So I'm not sure whether we can answer that question or how we can answer that question.
Well, making predictions about the future is something that I've always done with great gusto and been proved to be wrong pretty much every time. So taking that on board, I think the synthetic regime works whichever instrument you're taking, which it's not, it may be easier with some than with others, but it is not fundamentally pushing, in my view, and I don't know, Martina, you may have a different view, but it doesn't particularly push towards one particular structure or another. It's certainly not the case, and that I do know from long conversations with legislators and regulators, it's certainly not the case that the intention was to standardize the market. and that the regime was drafted in a way to encourage the standardization of the market. Now, you can't rule out that that standardization will occur anyway, but it was certainly not the intention, and I don't think there's anything in the regime itself that would necessarily push towards that standardization.
Well, I'd say on the transparency side, there is definitely more standardization on the data side, what needs to be delivered, and so on. I think there is more standardization than there was before, but to be honest, every single transaction also is different. It is definitely not as standardizable, to put it that way, as a true sale transaction is.
No.
So and also the tranches are rather small. So I mean, for there being a proper secondary market on say credit-linked notes, you do need a certain size for it to make sense. But if you're only selling a mezzanine tranche that is 100 million in size, and one investor can easily take it, but maybe there's several, but there won't be so many, and to have real liquidity in the market is unlikely, and there's also not a lot of senior paper that's going to go to the market either. So I think you will never get that kind of liquidity into a synthetic world.
Yeah, I think also militating against that liquidity and that tradability is the way the synthetic world operates. Obviously, you're taking mezzanine risk, you're taking first loss risk. The investors who tend to do that do a lot of work. They do a lot of analysis. They really do deep dives into the pools. And that sort of militates against the idea that you can then just find somebody, circulate a B where you can have somebody buy that. I mean, most investors who would want to consider buying in the secondary would want to do work that's really of a similar depth. And so that's not a very tradable, very liquid instrument as such. And if you look even at the mezzanine pieces of true sales securitizations, I don't get the sense that they trade a lot. I mean, yes, the AAAs will trade, but the double Bs, even in true sale, don't trade a lot. And I think in the case of synthetics, that's even harder hurdle to clear in order to have a really tradable instrument. I mean, it could change, and over the years, if standardization and disclosure really gets going, I think that may happen, but I think it's a very high hurdle.
So I'm not sure whether you would like to share some of the insights we've seen so far on deals we've been working, or you would like to leave that for the second session?
We probably leave it for the second because it makes more sense to have it in the context of the second. So we can certainly break up for the coffee, unless there are other questions. We can break up and have a longer coffee, or even, who knows, maybe a lunch, for those who do that kind of thing. And regroup at 12:50.
Yes, Central Eastern Time. Yes.
Central Eastern Time. Yes. 11:50 for my friends in the UK.
Thank you everyone for joining this first session. Please do join.
And presumably something like 5 o'clock in the morning if anybody's here from New York.
During the second sessions, where we actually go through the practical points that we have found so far, and deep dive into the actual rules of the synthetic STS securitization, which there tend to be quite a lot. Okay, thank you everybody, and see you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.